Welcome to the Storied Podcast. I'm your co-host, Chaz Becker, founder of Storied, and with me is my dear friend Jesse Ojeda, a doctoral student who is studying the intersection of the Christian faith, spirituality, religion, and psychology. Welcome, Jesse.
Thanks for having me again, Chaz. I'm excited for today's episode. We got a good one.
I know I'm excited for this. We had a good conversation before we started recording. And it's like, okay, just stop, hit the record button. Let's dive into it.
Rewind. Let's just start it. Start
Yeah,
recording.
start the conversation over. And so the question that we're talking about today is the question, what is a neural pathway? So I'll turn it over to Jesse for a quick definition and we'll jump into it.
Yeah. So really simply, let's just break down the word. We have neural and pathway. So neural is considering our neurons, the signals our brain fires throughout our body, throughout our mind to send information. And a pathway is a route. Those are routes that can be new, can be well trodden. Those are routes that can move anything from our smallest finger muscle to the muscles in our face to certain underlying beliefs that we have come back to time and time again are all things that our neurons go through different routes to fire and send those communications and signals. So we're going to talk about those today, how some of those, either new pathways or well-trodden beliefs are things that can affect our faith and our everyday walk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reason we wanted to bring this topic up is one, it's just becoming a more common conversation. Pastors are beginning to talk about neural pathways in sermons and attaching this and connecting it to how we grow in our faith and this idea of as we do things in our walk with Jesus, that it creates new neural pathways. And I think what our conversation is really being able to get down to like what we're actually talking about when we talk about having old neural pathways that are shaping and forming our everyday actions and behaviors and emotions, and what is the process to create new neural pathways, and what does that actually mean in our life and our walk with Jesus. And so I think the reason we're really stepping into this is because it's becoming more and more popular to talk about, but it's a very complex idea. And at times, I think it's almost oversimplified. And so we want to kind of have maybe a bit of a correctional action or a conversation around how we actually think about neural pathways. And so to start, here's kind of my general framework on a bit of the Christian life and why spiritual formation is so important is we are born and our soul is dead. We have a dead soul. And so then our brain and our body is separated and apart from the presence of God, who is helping us become more and more like him and being his ambassadors in the world, being his image bearers and his creation. And so then our bodies and our brains begin developing neural pathways that at times are affected and created through brokenness, sin, death, and ultimately are not how God initially created us to be. And then what happens is we meet Jesus, the Spirit comes in us and brings our soul to life. And now we're in this place that God, or where Paul talks about the sin and the flesh warring with one another. And as we think about this conversation, um, what do we do with that? What do we do with this idea that we have this flesh that's broken and may have neural pathways, well worn ones that aren't actually helpful in us being God's people and God's world? And how do we change those? And so I think, Jesse, as we were talking before, I think you have a really important kind of conversation about that from a psychological perspective.
Yeah, so I think there's a real beauty in the truth of neural pathways being able to change, and something I know we talk about in Storied, and is a concept that's coming up more within Christian sermons and sort of Christian spaces, is this idea of neuroplasticity, and that there are certain times within our development and at sometimes into adulthood, or our brain in some forms has the capacity to grow and change. That even though we have this long worn idea that we only where we kind of have the brain we're born with and we can't do anything about it. Modern neuroscience has taught us that there's more of a story there. There actually is a bit of malleability that we can affect, and I think in that excitement, a lot of people have rushed to make frameworks outside of neuroscience to say why that's so powerful, because we love a biological understanding. It's really easy to look and say, oh, we can point to this neuron growing or this neural pathway being reworked. And sometimes simplifying it to a problem of it not actually being helpful to live out and to apply to our lives. And one of the underlying aspects of neuroplasticity is it takes a really long time to grow and repeatedly develop a new pathway. To be able to make those connections and to keep doing it takes a really long amount of time. And thank God it can happen in the first place, but it isn't an immediate thing. And by no means does that pathway have to be established before we do the new thing. In actuality, it's reversed. The pathway develops because of the new thing that we are either living out, believing, or stepping into. And that, from a psychological standpoint, comes in a lot of different forms. That can come in living out a new behavior, choosing to, do a new habit, to engage in something repeatedly. By choosing to engage in that new pathway will grow. Sometimes it's correcting and developing new beliefs and discarding old beliefs. When we change some of our underlying cognitive schemas, is the word that we use in psychology, we then open up an ability for that new pathway to create. And once we start acting on those beliefs and accessing those beliefs over and over again, a new pathway develops because we've made the choice. We really have an agency in this process, not limited but by our biology, but our agency actually affects our biology. And that's what I think is really the powerful underlying facet of neuroplasticity and growing new neural pathways. So in many ways, when we're thinking about in this conversation from a spiritual standpoint, when we want to grow more comfortable in a new form of prayer, if we are new to Lectio Divina, if we're new to silent prayer, and it feels really uncomfortable and hard, we can think that, well, if I choose to keep doing this in a behavior, if I believe and try to repeat the belief and come to an understanding that this will be something that connects me closer with God, as I step into this practice and as I do it day after day, and days grow into weeks and weeks grow into months, it will become easier for me because my underlying neurology and neural wiring has actually adapted to help encourage this behavior, to make it easier for me to do that. Even when we might have started trying to sit in silence for 4 or 5 minutes and it's felt like an eternity, that's why when we grow in that over time, we can go from 5 minutes to 10 minutes to 20 minutes. Suddenly we might be in a 30-minute meditative period, and that feels as though we were there for 2. And that is because there is an underlying biological change that happens when we adapt our behaviors and our cognitions. And it can even affect our emotions and our response to our emotions over time, because these neural pathways make it easier for us to do. But that's not because the pathway just developed and then we were able to step into it. Our agency and our choice to follow after, as you said in Paul's language, to choose the spirit over the flesh, actually affects our underlying biology in order to do it. That was I know I threw a lot of concepts there. So dialogue with me. What do
Yeah,
you think
yeah,
about that?
absolutely. I think as you're sharing about that, like one of my critiques maybe of the spiritual formation space is like just do the practices and that's like what will change you. And I have a general like, yeah, that's helpful, but like not missing the work of the Holy Spirit in the midst of that.
Amen. Yeah.
And it's like as we take these steps of faith into wanting to become more like Jesus and start practicing these different practices, or identifying ways of thinking or behaving or emotional responses that are unhelpful, and we step into those things. It's asking the Spirit to fill us and to guide us into new ways of living that look more like Jesus. And as we do this, I think the beautiful thing in that is that, like, by His grace, our brain begins to rewire to
Yeah.
look like the ways that He's leading us into living in the world. And so He's actually like healing broken parts of our neurobiology. Um, and and so yeah, I love this idea of like, it's not change your neurobiology so that you like can be more like Jesus. It's no, take steps of faith by the power of the Spirit to become more like Jesus. And a byproduct is a literal like biological transformation that I believe is going back to being more in line with who we originally created us to be. Um, and I think that's like, some people on listening might be like, this feels like really like semantic, but I think it's really important that we're not trying to think that this process that takes years and years and years is something that we have to do to get to the point of change.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is, take a step of faith by the Spirit to do these practices, do whatever it is that He's leading you to do. And one of the byproducts is biological healing because
Yeah.
of the change. And I think that's different. And to me, it leads me to a place of like praising the Lord even more. Um,
Mm.
because it's leading me to a place um, of worship and gratitude, of one, that I can begin to look and be more like Him before my biology catches up, but two, how beautiful is it that He actually like cares enough that He would allow us to have that type of transformation at a biological
Yeah.
level.
Yeah, I think one helpful idea that's coming up for me to help it not just seem like a semantic change, but that there is a real important difference is through this idea of something we call in psychology the locus of control. So locus just means location, where it is. It's a more complicated word for that. So where does our ability to control from? Is it external, which means does someone have to do something for something to change? Or is it internal? Can I choose to walk into something that makes it change? And I think what's important about that structure is the first one that you talked about, where the pathway just changes and then we're able to step into it, makes it seem as though, oh, something external. I know this is a little bit confusing because we're talking inside of our mind. So we think internal, but that really is an external change because it means, oh, something outside of my control, like my biology just changed. And therefore I can do something different because of it, is a very different thing from an internal locus of control, which is I decided and was able by the power of the Spirit to change and change my behaviors, my thoughts, my language, these things, my response to my emotions. And by a product of that, this neural pathway grew and this neural pathway became more well trodden. And so many of our interventions, which is a more complicated word for the ways that we help people kind of solve their problems and solve their issues. So many interventions are based on instructing people of their internal locus of control, of the way that they have agency to make decisions that can change their life. They don't have to just think that, oh, well, this thing happened to me when I was a kid and I can't do anything about it. Or this is the deck of cards I was dealt. And therefore, I can't change anything about my life. Trying to redirect that and have people understand that they do have an ability there to step into that, maybe not to change everything, but to change a great deal. And they have more ability than they might think to do that, is a huge aspect, I think, of counseling and psychology in general. And the fact that we can apply that here to neuroplasticity, I think, is also really important.
Yeah, as you're talking, like, how beautiful is it that we're full of the Spirit who then can empower that internal locus of control, to help give life to that, to say that it's like, I
Yeah.
am the power to which this change can happen. And trust me, and I will make you brand new. Like, you have this new sense of power by the living God dwelling in you, to help you have that internal locus of control. And as I was thinking, I'm like, I can make this even more like complex because there's like this external power that's generating the internal locus of control. But I
Yeah.
think in a lot of ways that is the Christian story, that like we were dead and separated from God, and like we now have been made alive. And so now the power that rose Jesus from the dead dwells in us, and we can walk with him day by day, moment by moment. Um, and that one of the sweet, sweet responses to that, or um, reactions to that, is the healing of our brain. Um, and this always brings me back to, I think oftentimes in this conversation, we butcher Romans 12:1 and 2, because we jump to the renewing of our mind, and like that's the first, like, oh, be renewed, or be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But right before that, it says your body is a living sacrifice. And so what comes first? The first is doing things differently,
Yeah.
giving my body over as a living sacrifice. And the result of that is a renewing of my mind, so that then I understand the good and pleasing will of God, right? And I think in a
Yeah.
lot of ways what we're talking about is that paradigm, um, from a neurological level of like, we're we're stepping into this reality of like, yeah, my brain may be leading me down neural pathways that aren't helpful, but I'm going to live my life and use my body as a living sacrifice, to die to itself, to make different choices by the power of the spirit. And like in that, he's going to renew my mind, and then I will begin to understand even more deeply his love for us and his good and pleasing law.
Yeah. No, I think that's great.
So as people who are trying to help people step into this, and I think the as we kind of walk through the nuance of it, um, and I'm thinking of just Storied as a platform and helping people enter into different spiritual practices or different type of coping skills. What should a user of the platform of Storied, or other platforms like it, what should their expectations be? What should their like heart posture be as they enter into some of these different platforms and practices?
I think a good kind of corollary or thing that comes out of this idea of creating neural pathways, right, is if we think of any sort of organic growth, it is hard and it takes time and it needs to be nurtured in a way to be able to grow strong. And I think there's a great comp for that in these practices is a lot of these, especially to the, Western American mindset, are going to be uncomfortable because our culture rewards quick answers. It rewards pleasure over pain. It rewards working 24/7 and not resting. It does not reward the things that actually lead to our true um like spiritual and emotional well-being. So practices that start to push us there will feel uncomfortable at first. I think sometimes well-meaning Christians try these, maybe they have a friend recommend them to it and they try it once or twice and they say, I didn't really get it. I didn't feel any different, it didn't really happen for me the first few times, and because of that I was even just uncomfortable doing it, so I don't really see the benefit, or it's not for me. And the reality is any new habit, any new behavior that we start is going to take time to grow in a level of comfort. There's psychological ways that we have to develop that and just developing the habit. And then eventually over time, there will be quite literally biological changes and neural rewiring that happens to make it easier to engage that behavior over and over again for longer amounts of time. Um, there's a phrase that we use in psychology and in therapy called neurons that fire together, wire together. When we start to do these things regularly in terms of making a habit, it starts to kind of connect those things. That's why there's that concept of like habit stacking, right? To try and create a new habit that's already connected to something that you do. Because if you already have a strong pathway towards one thing, if like, for example, I every morning for years have made coffee as the first thing I do when I wake up. I could have no hope of getting through the day if it's not that. I started connecting a morning prayer practice to that, where I would pray as I was waiting for my coffee to brew, or I would go from my coffee to my prayer time because I knew I already had the habit well established, both as a psychological component and as a neural component of my body just used to wanting, demanding caffeine from me the minute I wake up, me and going and responding to that. By being able to stack that onto then a prayer practice, it actually made the prayer practice almost more quicker to develop and to lead from that because something was already there. Now, if we think about that, we can stack that to something that already exists. That's great. But if we're not, then we're starting from scratch. And that at times will feel uncomfortable, both for cultural reasons, for psychological reasons, and quite literally for neurological and biological reasons. So I think advice to kind of sum that up that I would give to people who are trying to engage with these practices is it's not going to take years, but it will take time. It'll take time to grow more comfortable with it, maybe to see the long-term effects. I mean, even even like things like quick medicine fixes we think of when it comes to any of our sicknesses, right? The ones that take the longest to actually develop is anything that affects our minds. Any psychotropic medications we take, most mental health professionals will say it's going to take at least 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks for you to see the changes for that to happen in your body. If that's already our body giving itself chemicals to change, versus us just trying to do behaviors and different beliefs and different practices to try and get our mind to change, think of how much longer that might take. And you'll see for sure small effects over time. And I think those can be really encouraging as we notice those small decreases in our anxiety, when we notice that we can be more mindful and present to a moment because we can be comfortable or grow in our tolerance of maybe the discomfort and anxiety of a moment, that we don't have to run away from it. We don't have to run away from those realities that we so often have done as a coping mechanism for most of our lives. When we learn to cope in more healthy manners rather than unhealthy ones, those of all empower us to see those small changes that will help, really create these pathways to grow over time, help solidify the habits psychologically, the schemas, and really just the underlying beliefs we have about these things that can all help us really start to enact this spiritual change, like we said, by the power of the spirit that Paul's talking about. And when it comes to these practices, what my advice would be is just to stick with it. Like I tell a lot of my clients that I see in therapy, well, it's not necessarily these practices specifically, but when I'm introducing practices that are uncomfortable, I say it's not going to be a magic bullet. You're not going to notice it immediately. It's not going to immediately change your problems. Quite frankly, you probably wouldn't be in the seat across from me in therapy if it were going to be that quick and it were just a simple little idea that you needed. Things that are really powerful take time to grow, take time to take root. And if we're going to sort of honor the power in that and the gift that it is, we have to lean into it despite whatever discomfort it may have.
You're like speaking to the biggest challenge of like running storied engagement wise. I'm just like,
Yeah.
oh, it makes it so hard as like just like as like a business that we're trying to do. It's like not the
Yeah.
like best business model of all time because it's just like not
Hmm.
quick hitting and like when someone joins the platform, something I communicate to them is like we like it's more begging. I'm like begging people at this point. Like, please give us at least 3 months of like consistent
Yeah.
engagement before you um make a reality check on like what this is, and is this like a beneficial platform for you? Because it's not something that's like, oh, I signed, logged in, and on day one, like my life has changed. It's like, no, like it's going to take a long time of interacting with the community and
Yep.
storied before like you really see the results. So I'm just laughing because I'm like, man, I should have picked something different that just like hits right on the first go. But I believe too much in this stuff to do that. But I'm just laughing
Yeah. We
at
didn't
that fact.
coordinate this on the way. I just came up with that. We
Yeah,
I wasn't trying to address it head on, but
it's
it speaks to the power of the thing of the curriculum, right? It speaks to the power of these practices that oftentimes the things that work best and work for the longest time are going to take consistent engagement, are going to take um, discipline and a bit of self-control. And that becomes encouraged when we start to see the changes that happen, right? Like if you think about um, I mean, and any sort of change that you're trying to make to your body, to your mind, to your relationships, even if you're just thinking socially, growing in trust with someone takes time. It takes time to be intentional in a relationship, to grow in relational vulnerability and intimacy. These things, they take effort, and they always are going to if they're going to be meaningful in the long term, right?
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that long term slow change is is really difficult, especially in our modern world where we are marketed to and people are developing products and all kinds of things to have quick, easy fixes for convenience sake. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, it just stepping into something that's so counter to that is is really difficult because the talking about neuropathic, you haven't like there's culturally you've been shaped to like have the thought that like, oh, this isn't working fast enough. Like, oh, this is like I didn't get enough out of it. Like that's something like
You have all these pathways you're already working against. Like that
yes,
is that we so often don't talk about that in the conversation is you have been formed by years of cultural messaging, of social messaging in your relationships, of your own internal messages to yourself, your own positive or negative self-talk is has maybe worn down pathways that might actually and oftentimes is making it a lot harder to engage with these. But the beauty and the gift is that, like we have this concept that's talked a lot about in psychology of nature versus nurture. That, to what degree is what we're born with, our genetics, our inheritance, really dictating our actions or our beliefs versus the things that we're able to do to either caretake for them or to choose besides them. And it's always a balance. And by beauty, I think truly of like the grace of God, there is a lot of power our nurture and our choices can take to um, to correct maybe the shortcomings of our inheritance, whether that be quite literally biological, social, cultural, familial, any of those spaces, we can by the power of the spirit, step into certain things to help heal and renew those parts of our brain and body.
yeah. Which leads to my advice on someone who wants to kind of step into these things is connect to that nurture piece or invite a friend, find a mentor who's been down this road even just a little longer than you, right? Isn't just beginning some of these practices. Someone who can help nurture you into it, help keep you accountable, right? And so if the if we need to step into these practices and step into this transformation for the long haul, then having a community of people around you to help encourage that is so important and 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 is quite necessary. Like there is a reason God called us to be in community. There's a reason that his bride is the church, because he needs us to be with one another as the body of Christ. And so if you're getting ready to hang up on this podcast and go on with your day, my kind of encouragement to you is find one practice that you're going to commit to for the next 3 months, and then invite one friend into it. And if you want to do that at story.org, we'd love to have you, but you don't need to. It's just hopefully a helpful resource in this area. But yeah, just call up that one friend and say, hey, I want to try doing Lectio Divina. I want to do a manual prayer. I want to try centering prayer. And I want to do that, every morning for the next 3 months. Will you join me? And just giving it a go and doing it together. And just give it 3 months before you make any type of evaluation on it. If a week in you're like, this is a waste of my time, that's a lie. Shut it down. Don't evaluate it for 3 months. But with that, we will wrap up this episode. Thank you again for listening. Love you guys. Take care.
See you next time.
All right.